In the spring of 1241, the heart of medieval Europe trembled. From the wind-swept steppes of the east came riders whose banners darkened the rising sun, the Mongols. Swift, silent, and relentless, they were the masters of movement. The storm of the steppe made flesh. Having crushed the Rus's cities, scattered the Cumans, and burned their way through Poland, the Mongol tide now turned toward the plains of Hungary, a land of open fields and fertile rivers, perfectly suited for their horse-borne warfare. At the center stood King Béla IV, proud, determined, and unaware of the full scale of the tempest that was about to descend. His kingdom, still recovering from years of internal strife, would soon face an enemy unlike any it had ever known. The calm that hung over Hungary that spring was not peace. It was the breath before the storm. The ashes of Kievan Rus' still smoldered when the Mongols turned their gaze farther west. Their scouts, lean and tireless, rode through the Carpathian passes, studying the land, counting rivers and fortresses, measuring the distance to their next conquest. To them, Europe was not a mystery, it was the next horizon. Across the plains of Hungary, King Béla IV faced a different kind of turmoil. His realm was still healing from internal rivalries, its nobility restless, its borders uncertain. When the Cumans, a proud nomadic people of the steppe, fled the Mongol advance and sought refuge in his kingdom, Béla saw an opportunity. He welcomed them as allies, imagining they could serve as skilled horsemen and guardians of his frontier. But what began as a gesture of strategy soon became a source of discord. The Cumans were strangers in a settled land. Their tents, customs, and wandering ways clashed with the Christian feudal order of Hungary. The nobles whispered that Béla had invited the enemy's spies into their midst. They saw in the Cumans not allies, but shadows of the Mongol horde that had already consumed the east. As suspicion grew, so did division. The unity Béla needed most was dissolving from within a kingdom, fracturing just as danger crept over its horizon. While the court argued and the nobles scorned their foreign guests, Mongol scouts were already threading through the mountain passes, silent and unseen, charting every village, every ford, every weakness. Europe's defenders had mistaken diplomacy for safety and fear for wisdom. In their pride, they believed the storm could be reasoned with. But the Mongols were not a storm to be reasoned with. They were the storm itself, and the road to invasion was already open. From the endless steppes of Central Asia, the Mongol war machine rolled forward like a living force of nature. It was not merely an army, it was a system, precise, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient. Where Europe still clung to feudal levies and local knights, the Mongols had built a war engine powered by speed, coordination, and ruthless intelligence. At its head rode Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, commander of men and conqueror of kingdoms. But it was Subutai, the old wolf of the steppes, who shaped the campaign. A strategist unmatched in his time, Subutai had already led Mongol armies from the shores of China to the walls of Vienna, calculating every battle like a chess player moving across continents. Under their command, 3 armies fanned out with terrifying precision. Batu and Subutai pressed through Transylvania, cutting deep into the Carpathian heartlands. To the north, Bidar and Khadan stormed through the mountain passes of Poland, scattering local forces before joining the greater host. And from the east, Orda, Batu's elder brother, swept across the plains, his horsemen moving like wind over grass, striking at will, vanishing before resistance could gather. Their timing was flawless attacks unfolding not as isolated thrusts, but as a single synchronized strike that stretched from Krakow to the Danube. While one force engaged, another flanked. When one withdrew, The others closed in. No medieval kingdom had ever faced such coordination, nor understood how to stop it. Europe's armies still fought by season and ceremony, gathering men only when the harvests allowed. The Mongols, in contrast, lived for war, their messengers riding day and night through the yam relay network, their movements directed like the turning of gears in a single vast machine. Hungary's nobles had dismissed the reports of scouts and survivors as rumor, the inventions of frightened peasants. They saw the Mongols as distant barbarians, not as an organized empire that studied its enemies before striking. But the truth was already galloping toward them, disciplined, unified, and unstoppable. The Mongols did not march blindly into Europe. They came with maps, intelligence, and a plan refined by experience. Their strength was not in numbers but in knowledge, and Europe's greatest weakness was its ignorance. As the hooves thundered westward and the smoke of burning villages marked their path, the lesson was clear. Medieval Europe had entered an age of professional conquest, and the old ways of defense would not survive the new art of war. The year was 1241, the spring when Europe's heart began to break. From the passes of Transylvania came news of fire and ruin. The Mongols had crossed the Carpathians. Villages vanished in a single night, fortresses crumbled, and entire garrisons were erased before word could even reach the king. It was not war as Europe understood it. It was annihilation made methodical. The defenders of Transylvania fought bravely, but bravery meant little against precision. Mongol siege. Engineers dragged Chinese-built machines through the mountains, turning stone keeps into dust. Scouts were cut down before they could warn the next town. The survivors fled west, and behind them rode the storm. King Béla IV gathered his strength on the plains of the Sajo River, assembling what seemed a formidable host, nearly 60,000 men, knights, nobles, and peasants alike. However, their strength was illusion. They were divided in command, untested in unity, and weighed down by the arrogance of a kingdom that had never faced a true modern war. As campfires lit the Hungarian night, few realized they had already been surrounded. The Mongols moved like smoke. Subutai, the master strategist, had studied his enemy as one studies a prey animal watching for habit, waiting for overconfidence. When the Hungarians fortified the bridge over the Sajo, believing they had blocked the only crossing, Subutai simply built another. Under the cover of darkness, Mongol engineers assembled a pontoon bridge, silent and efficient, across which cavalry poured like water slipping around stone. At dawn on April 11th, 1241, the trap snapped shut. Batu Khan struck from the front with thunderous force, drawing the Hungarians forward in triumph. Then, from behind, Subutai's columns surged over the river, cutting off retreat. Arrows rained from every side, the dreaded Mongol whistle arrows that sang as they killed. The Hungarian camp erupted in chaos. Horses panicked, lines broke, and what began as battle dissolved into slaughter. Within hours, the proud army of Hungary ceased to exist. The plain of Mohi was choked with the fallen knights crushed beneath fleeing men, banners trampled into the mud. The flower of the Hungarian nobility, the very core of its defense, was gone. King Béla IV escaped only by miracle, fleeing south through the Danube's crossings, his crown tarnished by blood and loss. Behind him lay a kingdom shattered, its army destroyed, its castles empty, its borders wide open. The victory of the Mongols at Mohi was not just a triumph of arms. It was a lesson in the price of underestimating an enemy who studied before he struck. Europe's chivalry had met its match and found itself obsolete. As the smoke drifted over the Sajo River and the crows gathered on the field, the message was written in fire and silence. Medieval pride had met professional conquest, and the age of knights had fallen to the bow of the steppe. The Kingdom of Hungary lay open, and the storm showed no mercy. After the slaughter at Mohi, the Mongol armies fanned out across the land, their riders sweeping through the plains like wildfire carried by wind. From the eastern marches to the Danube itself, no province escaped the terror that followed. Eger, Esztergom, Pest, and Buda, proud cities of faith and trade, were reduced to ash and silence. Whole populations vanished from the records, their names erased not by time, but by fire. The Mongols understood terrain as no European general ever had. The Hungarian Alfold, flat and exposed, was the perfect killing ground for steppe cavalry. There were no mountains to block the charge, no forests thick enough to hide an army. Every movement was visible, every retreat predictable. The Mongols turned Hungary's geography into their greatest ally. And so, the horror that unfolded was not blind chaos. It was deliberate, systematic, and efficient. Cities that resisted were obliterated. Fortresses that surrendered were looted, then abandoned. The Mongols spared no illusions of mercy. They struck not only to conquer, but to break the will to resist. Chroniclers wrote of the Danube running dark with ash and blood, of villages where the only survivors were dogs scavenging among the dead. King Béla IV, now a fugitive, fled from one refuge to another, seeking aid from neighboring rulers who trembled behind their own walls. None dared challenge the Mongol horde. Hungary, once a Christian bulwark in the east, had become a wasteland, and yet amid the ruin, lessons were born from tragedy. The survivors, peasants, monks, and scattered nobles learned that wooden palisades and open towns could no longer withstand the new art of war. They fled into mountains, forests, and monasteries, places the Mongols could not easily reach. The few stone fortresses that did exist, small and isolated, sometimes held out proof that strength now lay not in numbers, but in walls. What followed was a transformation born of desperation. The age of wood gave way to the age of stone. Hungary's landscape, once open and undefended, began its slow rebirth as a kingdom of fortified castles, walled towns, and strongholds built to endure the siege rather than meet the charge. It was a bitter evolution, paid for in blood. The Mongols rode on, leaving behind a silence deeper than defeat, a land half empty, its fields untended, its faith shaken. Yet even in that silence, the seeds of renewal were buried under the ash. For Hungary had learned at a terrible cost that survival would no longer depend on valor alone. The courage of the sword would now be joined by the wisdom of the wall. The devastation of 1241 was not just the ruin of a kingdom. It was the crucible that would forge a new one. The storm that shattered Hungary did not stop. At her borders, its echo rolled across Europe like thunder. Word of the Mongol invasion traveled faster than the riders themselves, carried by refugees, merchants, and trembling monks who spoke of entire cities turned to dust. They came in endless waves, Hungarians, Poles, Cumans flooding into Austria, Bohemia, and the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, bringing tales too terrible to believe and too consistent to dismiss. Every account was the same. An enemy that moved with an impossible speed, that killed without hesitation, that left no survivors. They called them the Tartars. As if born from Tartarus itself, demons from the east, not men. Rumors claimed the Mongols were the punishment of God, a scourge sent for the sins of Christendom. In monasteries, scribes wrote of riders who could not die, whose arrows found men hiding behind walls, whose horses never tired. In a world bound by faith, fear became doctrine. In Rome, Pope Innocent IV read the reports and did what no sword could. He called for unity. Letters flew to kings and emperors, urging them to put aside their quarrels and prepare for the defense of Christendom. But Europe was still a patchwork of pride and politics. The kings of France and England argued over their own borders. The princes of the empire squabbled over titles, and in the midst of it all, the Mongols remained the only power truly united. Even so, the lesson began to take root. The Mongol victories had revealed the weakness of the old order. Chivalry, once the glory of Europe, was no match for strategy, speed, and coordination. Castles that had once stood as symbols of pride were suddenly exposed as outdated, built for feuds, not for survival. The fortification of borders, the reorganization of armies, and the study of intelligence and communication, these ideas, once foreign, now became urgent necessities. In Vienna, walls were strengthened and scouts sent east. In Bohemia, King Wenceslaus gathered his knights and drilled them for a war that might never reach him, but might destroy him if it did. Across the empire, the clergy preached repentance, but the soldiers preached readiness. The idea of a united Europe, still fragile and uncertain, flickered to life not in peace, but in terror. Yet, under the panic lay a deeper truth. The Mongols had forced Europe to look in the mirror. The kingdoms that had thrived on rivalry now saw how division made them weak. The lords who had lived by privilege began to learn the value of preparation. The Mongols had not only brought destruction, they had exposed complacency. And so, as the refugees told their tales and the bells of Christendom rang for unity, Europe began to change, not because of victory, but because of survival. Fear, for all its cruelty, became the teacher that pride had never allowed. The Mongols had shown the West what the East already knew, that empires fall not from invasion, but from arrogance. And while the horsemen rode back into the shadows, their lesson remained etched in stone and memory, that peace without vigilance is merely the pause before the next storm. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the storm began to fade. In the early months of 1242, when Hungary lay silent below the ashes of its own ruin, the Mongols turned away. The horsemen who had shattered kingdoms and scattered armies simply vanished into the eastern horizon. Villagers peered from forests and monastery walls, expecting another wave of fire, but it never came. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the invasion itself. Why they left has haunted historians ever since. Some point to the news that had traveled from the far side of Asia, the death of Batu Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire. The call to return to Mongolia and decide the next ruler could not be ignored, even by Batu Khan. The Mongol system was built not only on conquest, but on obedience to the will of the Khan. No campaign, however glorious, could continue when the heart of the empire called its commanders home. Others suggest a more practical reason. The spring thaw had come early that year, and the plains of Hungary, once dry and hard beneath Mongol hooves, had turned to mire. The mighty steppe horses sank into the flooded marshes, their speed stolen by the land itself. The same terrain that had doomed the Hungarian cavalry now betrayed the conquerors. Nature, indifferent and patient, had done what armies could not. It slowed the storm. There is yet another view that the Mongols, for all their victories, had reached the limits of strategy. Their supply lines stretched thin across thousands of miles, their men weary from a year of constant war. Every campaign, even the most disciplined, reaches a point where momentum gives way to exhaustion. The empire's strength was unity and speed, But in Europe they had found only distance and defiance, and so the Mongols withdrew, not in defeat, but in calculation. They left behind no treaties, no rulers, no tribute, only ruins and silence. To the survivors it seemed divine intervention. Chronicles written in monasteries told of angels driving back the invaders, of heavenly wrath turned away by prayer. But the truth, as always, was more human. The Mongols left because empire, even theirs, obeyed the laws of nature and necessity. King Béla IV returned to his kingdom, but what he found was not a nation. It was a graveyard. Cities lay empty, fields untended, and the nobility that once challenged his rule was gone. The crown he had fled with now weighed heavier than ever, for he ruled over ghosts. Yet in that desolation, a strange opportunity was born, the chance to rebuild not what Hungary had been, but what it might become. The Mongols vanished beyond the Carpathians, leaving behind the legend of their invincibility and the ruins of their triumph. Europe breathed again, but the air was changed. The West had stared into the face of an empire that spanned the world and learned that survival was no longer a gift of faith, but a discipline of preparation. The storm had passed, but its shadow remained, etched into the memory of every field they had burned, every bell that had tolled for the dead. The Mongols had come, seen, and departed not defeated, but disinterested, leaving Europe with a single, sobering truth. That even the mightiest terror can fade, but its lessons endure far longer than its footprints in the mud. Out of ruin came resolve. When King Béla IV returned to his shattered kingdom, he found not the Hungary he had fled, but the ashes of one city's burned, fields empty, the nobility broken. Yet from this devastation rose a king remade. Historians would later call him the founder of a second Hungary, a monarch who learned from disaster rather than denying it. Béla saw clearly what pride had hidden before. Walls, not words, would guard the kingdom. He ordered the construction of stone fortresses across the land, more than 100 of them strongholds that would turn open plains into lines of defense. No longer would Hungary stand naked before the horsemen of the East. He invited Germans, Slavs, and even the Cumans, once feared as traitors, to return and rebuild. From diversity came renewal, from exile, strength. Fields were sown again, towns recharted, and life crept back across the silent countryside. The scars of war became the foundations of resilience. Royal authority, once weakened by feudal pride, grew firm under Béla's hand. He forged a new army, disciplined and prepared, grounded not in arrogance, but in vigilance. The lessons of Mohi were written into Hungary's future. Never again would complacency be mistaken for peace. By the time the Mongols threatened Europe once more, Hungary stood ready, fortified, unified, and watchful. The kingdom that had fallen rose again, not through vengeance, but through wisdom earned in fire. The storm had passed, but its mark endured, carved in stone, built into castles, and carried in memory. From devastation, Hungary was reborn. The Mongol invasion of Hungary left more than ruins. It left a reckoning. In a single year, the armies of the steppe exposed the fragility of medieval warfare. The proud European cavalry, weighed down by armor and tradition, found itself powerless against speed, coordination, and deception. The Mongols had proven that victory belonged not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable. Their campaign taught Europe harsh but lasting lessons, the value of intelligence and reconnaissance, the necessity of mobility and communication, and above all, the power of stone over valor. Fortifications, once symbols of prestige, became instruments of survival. However, their shadow stretched deeper than strategy. For generations, the phrase Tartar terror haunted the chronicles of Europe, a memory of fire, flight, and helplessness. Monks wrote of the Mongols as punishment from God. Kings remembered them as the measure of unpreparedness. But out of fear came reform. In Hungary, the catastrophe of 1241 became the foundation of centralized strength. The kingdom's walls rose higher, its armies disciplined, its kings wiser. Across Europe, rulers reimagined defense, turning faith into foresight. Beyond the Carpathians, the Golden Horde took shape the western edge of a vast Mongol world that would dominate the steppes for centuries, shaping the politics and peoples of Eastern Europe and the Balkans. The Mongols didn't stay, but they changed everything they touched. They taught a continent that survival demands adaptation, and that arrogance in peace invites ruin in war. In the silence that followed their retreat, Europe began to rebuild, not as it had been, but as it had learned to be. Hungary burned, yet from its ashes rose a realm transformed. The Mongols came like thunder from the east, leaving behind silence and smoke. They vanished as suddenly as they arrived, but their shadow lingered, etched into memory, carved into stone. The plains that once invited invasion became the proving ground of a nation reborn. King Béla IV turned defeat into renewal, forging a Hungary that would stand as a bulwark between East and West. Walls rose where once there were none, alliances where once there was pride. The lesson was clear. No kingdom, however distant or proud, lies beyond the reach of the steppe. The storm passed, but its echo remained a warning carried through centuries. From ruin came resilience, from fear, foresight. And in that transformation, Hungary found not just survival, but strength. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe.